Welcome to our reading on economics with me, Jonathan Bone. Right, okay, what have we got in economics? First of all, it's 10% of the syllabus, so we're going to see approximately 24 questions on economics in the exam, split between microeconomics, macroeconomics, and foreign exchange. Now, typically with economics, you tend to find that either people have covered some of this material before, maybe in an undergraduate degree course, or they haven't, in which case economics is a very different proposition for different people. If you have seen some of this before, then fantastic, it's going to be a nice, easy area for you. However, I would still warn against skim reading. You need to make sure you've got the detail. You need to know how the CFA Institute actually tackle each topic. Now, of course, if you haven't done this before, then really it's quite a daunting prospect. We're really looking at a fair amount of content here, a lot of pages to cover for your 10%. Okay, well, let's start our economics reading, and we're going to be looking at demand and supply analysis within microeconomics. Our first LOS asks us to distinguish between different types of market. Now, the two types of market we need to talk about here are factor markets and product markets. And this is a lovely, easy introductory learning outcome here. So our factor markets, what are they? They are markets for the factors of production. And a factor of production is anything that goes into the productive process. In other words, anything that goes into the process of producing finished goods. So it's raw material, labour, etc. Now, of course, who buys the factors of production? Well, it's going to be the firms that are producing goods. So firms are buyers in the factor market. We then talk about the products market. Here, we're talking about the output of the firms. So in other words, we're talking about finished goods. So these are services and finished goods. This time, of course, rather than the firm being a buyer, the firm is the seller of the finished goods. And we have customers in the marketplace that are going to be the purchasers. So we talk about consumers. Now, we also have intermediate markets. And of course, this is just the situation where one firm's finished product is used in the production, i.e. as a factor of production, for another firm's output. Okay, now, of course, we're talking about a firm that is producing component elements that go into the production of another firm's goods or services. Right, our next LOS asks us to explain the principles of supply and demand. And first of all, the thing we can see right at the top of the slide here is a demand function. The quantity demanded, QDX in our equation, equals, and we've got the F symbol there, it's a function of, in other words, it's a function of the price of X, I, which is income levels, and PY, the price of related products. Okay, well, let's just take each one of those at a time. So we're talking about the demand curve, and the demand curve, of course, is measuring consumers' willingness to buy. Now, let's have a look at our elements in there. We've got the price of the good, individual's income, and also the price of related products, PY. Now, of course, we'd expect a negative relationship between quantity demanded and the price of the good. In other words, as price starts to rise, consumers demand less. So notice this gives us a downward sloping demand curve. We can see the relationship plotted by our demand curve between price and quantity. As price goes up, quantity goes down. As price falls, the quantity demanded by consumers is going to increase. Now, this phenomenon that as price falls, quantity demanded rises is known as the law of demand. And it's very typical, isn't it? As prices drop, people can consume more. Now, again, it's not always 100% the case that will hold, but normally it will do. Okay, so we're expecting a negative relationship between quantity and prices. What about individuals' income? As individuals' incomes essentially rise, we'd expect them to demand more. Essentially, they've got more disposable income, so they should consume more products. So we'd expect maybe a positive relationship with income. Again, might not always be the case, and we'll talk about that a little later. The price of related products. Well, here we've got to think about two things. We've got to think about substitute products. Now, of course, if a product is a substitute, as the price of that substitute rises, you'd expect people to consume less of the substitute product and more of our product. So you'd expect demand to rise as the price of related substitutes increases, maybe a positive relationship. If we're looking at a complement, maybe, the idea of gin and tonic, the two things are complements. Now, of course, if the price of gin goes up, people consume less gin, and as a result, they would consume less tonic water. So we'd expect maybe a negative relationship with our complements. Now, again, we've just got three factors here: the price of the good, income, and price of related goods. Again, we're not saying this is the only factors that drive demand. Many, many more, of course, can be added. Now, I think at this point as well, it's worth talking about exogenous and endogenous factors within our model. If we look at our model, what we're really looking at is how price, so when we look at our demand curve, how price and quantity are related. In other words, set a quantity that determines price, or set a price and that determines quantity. Therefore, we're going to refer to these factors as endogenous. They're driven from within our demand curve. The other factors that we've got in our model here, individuals' incomes and the price of related products, those are going to be exogenous factors. In other words, their prices are determined by markets that we're not looking at when we see this demand curve. In other words, they're driven by supply and demand in other marketplaces. So we have endogenous factors that are explained by our demand curve and exogenous factors that are set by other markets outside of ours. Let's look at the supply function. So, of course, this is looking at firms' willingness to sell. Now, notice we're saying here the quantity supplied is a function of price. Now, again, notice we've got a positive relationship here. As the firm can receive a higher price, it's willing to sell more. So it's certainly a function of price, but it's also a function of the cost of production. Okay, and again, price and quantity are going to be our endogenous factors, and the cost of production are going to be our exogenous factors, not determined by our supply function, determined by other markets. Labour cost, of course, is affected by supply and demand in the labour market. Now, again, of course, we'd expect maybe a negative relationship with the cost of production. As it costs more to produce the goods and services, the firm would be willing to sell less at any given price. So when we look at our cost of production, a negative relationship, what have we got in there? We've got labour costs, material costs, overheads, etc. Now, our next LOS asks us to describe shifts and movements along the demand curve, and also movements in the demand curve. Now, okay, let's start with this first of all. Let's look at our endogenous factors, which of course are price. Now, the idea is, of course, as price changes, quantity changes. In other words, movements in price move us up and down our demand curve. Let's have a look at that. So here we are initially at P0 with quantity Q0 being demanded. If the price rises, that shifts us along our demand curve. And of course, the quantity demanded drops to Q1. So movements in price shift us along our demand curve. Now, what we then need to do is look at factors that shift the demand curve itself. Now, what you'll notice straight away is the factors that cause movements in the demand curve itself are our endogenous factors. And you can see we've got factors that affect demand and factors that affect supply. So in other words, our endogenous factors, price and quantity, shift us along the demand curve. Our exogenous factors shift the demand curve itself. So what were our exogenous factors? They were things like income levels, the price of substitutes, the price of complements. Now, of course, as income levels rise, we'd expect more to be demanded at any given price. We'd expect the demand curve to shift outwards. If income falls, we'd expect less to be demanded at each price. The demand curve shifts downwards. Price of substitutes. As they rise, we'd expect more to be demanded at any given price for our product. In other words, the demand curve will shift outwards. Price of complements, now of course, if they rise, that means there'll be less demand for our product at any given price. We'd expect our demand curve to fall. So remember, typically a positive relationship with income, positive relationship with the price of substitutes, but a negative relationship with complements. So a decrease in demand would be caused by income levels falling, the price of substitutes essentially falling, or the price of substitutes falling, or the price of complements rising. Flip side, of course, is an increase in demand would be caused by income levels rising, the price of substitutes rising, or the price of complements falling. So positive relationships with the first two, negative relationships with the third. So notice, therefore, that changes in our endogenous factors, price and quantity, will shift us along the demand curve. Changes in any of the other variables in our demand function, i.e. the exogenous variables, shift the curve itself. And of course, exactly the same is the case for the supply curve. In other words, changes in price and quantity shift us along the supply curve. Changes in any of the other factors, of course, will shift the supply curve as well. So notice an increase in supply shifts the supply curve out. Notice now that the firm is willing to supply more at any given price. Now, what will cause this to happen? Typically reductions in the price of, or the cost of, producing the goods and services. So if raw materials fall, if labour costs fall, if overheads fall. A decrease in supply typically is going to be caused by our exogenous factors rising in price. So raw materials essentially become more expensive, labour more expensive, overheads more expensive. Notice now, at any given price, the firm is willing to supply a lower quantity. Now, the next reading is really rather straightforward. It asks us, what is the process of aggregating demand and supply curves? Now, actually, we've been looking at demand and supply functions, first of all, so what we then need to do is just take our process on one step further to look at demand and supply curves. Now, first of all, our demand and supply function, we can see there that we've got a supply function. The quantity supplied equals 250 plus 2.5 px. So we've only got one factor in this model, and that's the price. Now, again, where do these numbers come from? Typically, it would come from regression analysis. Now, what we're looking at when we see our supply function there is a single firm. So how do we get supply for the entire industry? It's a dead straightforward process. All we're going to have to do is sum the supply functions. In other words, add the supply functions, add these equations for every firm within the industry. Now, let's imagine we've got 50 firms within the market. Now, we are going to make another assumption here. We're going to assume that they're all identical. In other words, they all have exactly the same supply functions. Okay, so all we're going to need to do is add this supply function 50 times to get the market supply function. So here we go. Market supply, therefore, must be, and again, this is the market supply function. And notice when we talk about function, the major output of our model is quantity. So let's just multiply our negative 250 by 50 and our 2.5 px by 50. And of course, what we're going to get, therefore, is that the quantity supplied equals minus 12,500 plus 125 times the price of the good, px. Now, again, that is the market supply function. If we want the market supply curve, there's a slight difference. Function has quantity as its output. The supply curve has price as its output. So we need to do a little bit of rearranging and solve for price. So notice if we invert this function and solve for price, then we find that price is equal to 0.008 times quantity plus 100. Now this, of course, is the equation of our supply curve. So let's make sure we're very happy about that difference. This is our supply curve. This is our supply function. Okay, so a function has quantity as its output in the equation. A curve has price. Price is the, if you like, the dependent variable. Now notice as well, we've got 0.008 qs, and that 0.008 is going to be our slope coefficient, i.e. our gradient of our supply curve. Okay, so aggregating to get the aggregate supply or the total supply of the marketplace is very, very straightforward. All we have to do is sum the supply functions of each firm within the marketplace. And the same is true of demand. If we want market demand, the aggregate demand in the marketplace, all we need to do is sum the demand functions of each firm within the market. Okay, now we're asked to describe equilibrium quantities and price. Notice that the equilibrium quantity and price, the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. So we're saying very straightforwardly that QD equals QS. Make that a bit clearer that it's the equal sign. The quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Now, the LOS here asks us to distinguish between two types of equilibrium: partial equilibrium and general equilibrium. Now let's start with our partial equilibrium. Change the price of the good, hold other factors constant. In other words, it's the equilibrium, it's the price that means quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, but we're holding all of our other factors constant. Now what do we mean by holding all of our other factors constant? We're talking about our exogenous variables. So remember when we looked at demand, we talked about income levels, we talked about the price of complementary products, prices of substitutes. We're keeping all of their prices constant in this model, in a partial equilibrium. Why? Because their prices, of course, are determined by supply and demand in other markets. So partial equilibrium just looks at the price, that means quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, but it assumes that the exogenous factors within our model are constant. Now, let's compare that to general equilibrium. Slightly more complicated concept here. What we're looking at now is the price, that means quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, but we're not holding all of the other factors constant. In other words, we've got to analyse the equilibriums in other markets for our exogenous factors, such as income levels, such as price of complements, such as prices of substitutes. So notice it's taking into account changes in the price of other factors other than simply our good. So it's looking at equilibrium in the markets for our exogenous factors as well. And hence it's a more complicated concept. Right, let's talk about equilibrium quantity and price. What we've got there is our supply curve. Notice we're calling it marginal cost. And our demand curve, which we're referring here to as marginal benefit. Let's just explain that for a second. Why could the demand curve be called marginal benefit? Well, the argument is a consumer essentially will only be willing to pay as much as the marginal benefit that they get from consuming a unit. In other words, the maximum price you would pay for the next unit consumed is equal to the additional benefit you gain from consuming it. Now, the additional benefit we gain from consuming an extra unit is known as marginal benefit. And it's going to be massively closely linked to the concept of utility that we see in a later reading. Now, the supply curve, notice we're calling it marginal cost. In other words, the firms would only be willing to sell goods, an additional good, at the marginal cost of producing it. In other words, they're going to want to charge at least the cost of producing an extra unit. Okay, so we talk about marginal cost and marginal supply. So think about marginal benefit as the maximum price a consumer would be willing to pay, and think about marginal cost as the minimum price that a firm would be willing to accept. Okay, so now we're going to look at equilibrium, quantity and price. Now we said equilibrium is just where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And we've labelled it up on our diagram here. At a price of $500 per tonne, 3,000 units are sold, and quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Notice if the quantity is below 3,000 units, then marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. Let's imagine that we're looking at this amount here. There is our marginal benefit. Here is our marginal cost. In other words, consumers are benefiting more than it costs to produce. So surely, therefore, the market should produce more goods. And as they produce more goods, the benefit we get from consuming that extra output is going to drop, the cost is going to rise, until eventually we end up at a point where the cost of producing an additional unit is equal to the benefit of consumption. And that, of course, is our equilibrium point. Now, of course, notice as well that if the quantity is above the equilibrium quantity, then our marginal benefit, the benefit we get from consuming an extra unit, is lower than the additional cost of producing that extra unit. Okay, so it makes sense, therefore, to cut back on production. As we cut back on production, the marginal benefit, the additional benefit of consumption is going to rise, and the marginal cost of producing is going to fall until, again, we end up at the equilibrium. So, again, the idea is we should be operating at an equilibrium point where the benefit of consuming one extra unit is equal to the cost of producing it. Now, we're also asked in this LOS to be able to describe the mechanisms that move us towards equilibrium. Okay, so let's have a look at our diagram here. We've got our demand curve, marginal benefit, and we've got our supply curve, marginal cost. And notice we've set a price here that is above the equilibrium price. It's above the price where quantity demanded would equal quantity supplied. Now notice, because the price is above, notice therefore that the quantity demanded, and you can see our quantity demanded just down here, notice the quantity demanded is far less than the quantity supplied. Okay, what does this mean? Well, of course, it means we've got excess supply. Now, think about this in terms of the labour market, of course. If wages are above equilibrium wages, then essentially the quantity of labour demanded is less than the quantity of labour supplied. What's the difference between the two? Well, in the labour market, of course, we're talking about unemployment. Now, the idea in economics is if we have excess supply, that excess supply will bid down prices. In the labour market, it means unemployed workers would bid down wages. And of course, as wages or prices in this model drop, we move closer and closer to the equilibrium level. So the excess supply is going to bid down price, and when that happens, price is going to eventually fall until we're back at our equilibrium level. Okay, so that's one mechanism where price is above the equilibrium level. Let's have a look at the second situation where price is below the equilibrium level. So now, of course, notice this time our quantity supplied is way lower than the quantity demanded. In other words, we have excess demand. There's more demand than there is supply. So how do you, as a consumer, make sure that you get some of the product to consume? Well, maybe you'll bid a slightly higher price. In other words, the excess demand is going to bid up prices until we get back to our equilibrium level. And of course, as prices start to rise, suppliers will be willing to increase their production. So the excess demand bids up prices until we get back to the equilibrium level. So the argument here is, in a normal market, there is an automatic tendency for the market to move towards equilibrium. If price is above the equilibrium level, excess supply will bid down prices. If price is below equilibrium, excess demand will bid up prices. And this we refer to, of course, as the market mechanism, the idea that equilibrium is established within a market. Now, we are here asked to describe or discuss stable and unstable equilibrium. Now, we've got some diagrams here, and I'll take you through those diagrams. But first of all, I want to set you up with some rules that will make this learning outcome absolutely a piece of cake. So distinguish and identify stable and unstable equilibrium. Okay, let me just blank out a box for us. Oops, I don't want grey, I want white. Hang on a second. There we go. Okay, let's just blank this slide out just for a second and write down our rules here. Okay, now, these are the requirements for a stable equilibrium. And I want to really think about two scenarios here. I want to think about price being above the crossover point. What am I talking about when I say crossover here? I just mean simply where supply and demand intersect. Now, if price is above the crossover point, we need supply to be greater than demand. And we know why we need it, because this will force prices down and will move back towards equilibrium. So if the price is above the point where supply and demand intersect, then supply needs to be greater than demand, because that will force price back towards the equilibrium level. An unstable equilibrium would simply be a situation where demand is greater than supply and yet price is above the crossover point. In other words, in that scenario, because demand outstrips supply, price would continue to rise. In other words, would move further and further away from our equilibrium and hence would be unstable. Now, of course, if price is below our crossover point, then essentially for a stable equilibrium we need demand to be greater than supply, because of course that's going to cause our price to rise. Now, of course, therefore, unstable scenarios will be the reverse of this, where supply outstrips demand even though the price is below the crossover point, and that causes prices to fall. In other words, we move further and further away from our equilibrium points. Now let's have a little look at our diagrams then and see if we can now make sense of those. Now notice our first diagram. So here we are with our first diagram here. And notice this talks about stable equilibrium. Notice if our price, let's say, is above the equilibrium point, there's our equilibrium point. If our price is above, here is demand, here is supply. Supply outstrips demand, and we know that's going to force prices down. Again, if prices are below our crossover point, then notice that supply is lower than demand, and that's going to force prices up. So we're looking at a classic stable equilibrium. Let's look at our unstable equilibrium down here. Again, there's our crossover point where supply and demand intersect. Notice here, if price is above, here is supply, here is demand. Demand outstrips supply. And of course, when demand outstrips supply, prices are going to rise. In other words, we're moving further and further away from the equilibrium. Notice with a price that is essentially below the crossover point, here's demand, here's supply. We've got excess supply, which is going to force prices even further downwards. So we're going to move in that direction. So notice there's no tendency in this diagram for us to move back to the equilibrium point. When price moves away from equilibrium, whether it's above equilibrium or below, it then moves further and further away. Let's have a look at our other two diagrams. Let's clear some ink off this for a second. So let's have a look at our diagram over here. Now let's have a look. We've got stable equilibriums here. Again, fairly straightforward, applying our rules. Here's the equilibrium price. If price is above, here is the quantity demanded, here is the quantity supplied. We've got excess supply, price is therefore going to be bid down. If price is below the equilibrium level, here's the quantity supplied, here's the quantity demanded, we've got excess demand, the price is going to be bid up. Okay, our final diagram that we've got now to have a quick look at has both a stable and an unstable equilibrium point on it. Notice, though, the wild and wonderful supply curve that we've had to introduce to get that. Now, first of all, let's start. Notice we've got two crossover points here, which is a little unusual. So let's put this crossover point and this crossover point. First of all, let's start off with a price that is below the lower crossover point. Let's start down here. Notice here we'd have this amount being supplied, this amount being demanded. In other words, excess demand, and we know that will force price up. So we'll move towards that stable equilibrium. Let's look at the point in between the two crossovers. Here's demand, here's supply. We've got excess supply, and that will force prices down, so we'll move back towards the stable equilibrium. Now, the interesting point on this one is, what about if we're above the top crossover? Well, notice here is supply, here is demand. We've got excess demand, so price then will move further and further away from that equilibrium. Okay, so remember, apply the rules. If you're if price is above the crossover point, you need supply to be greater than demand for a stable equilibrium, and if price is below the crossover point, you need demand to be greater than supply. Now we need to talk a little bit here about price bubbles. Notice a bubble is an unsustainable increase in price. In other words, we're talking about markets here being irrational. Now notice it says a recent increase in price for an asset is believed to indicate future price increases. In other words, the market believes that the future is going to rise simply because it's rising in the current point in time. Now again, this is largely irrational. We're looking at behavioural finance here, where we're looking at essentially, I guess, almost what you can believe in terms of confidence. It's a bit linked to Keynes's animal spirits, where he argued that booms were caused by increases in confidence and busts were caused by the market losing confidence. Another great phrase for it was coined by Alan Greenspan, where he talked about irrational exuberance, i.e. the market ramping upwards in price where there's no rational explanation for that. Okay, now, when have we seen it? We've seen it most recently in the property market prior to the financial markets crash in 2007, 2008. We saw rapid increases in property prices. Prior to that, we saw it in tech stocks before the year 2000, where we saw the growth in tech stocks and then the burst of the bubble in 2000. Where's it going to be next? Because we see these price bubbles again and again and again in financial markets. Well, maybe given all the quantitative easing programs creating an unrealistic demand for government bonds, maybe it'll be government bonds, the next bubble to burst. Who knows? Okay, so that's the idea of price bubble. Notice the demand for the asset increases as anticipated price increases attract buyers. In other words, we start to attract buyers simply because prices are rising. And that increases our equilibrium price as demand shifts further and further and further out. Now, of course, at some point, there's going to be a market correction because the equilibrium price no longer really reflects the utility from the product. There's no real driver behind our bubble. And, of course, the bubble will burst and the demand will drop. And essentially what happens, therefore, is price comes down to a new equilibrium. The market will correct its overpricing. Then we get these bubbles and bursts, irrational exuberance, followed by a rational crash. Right, our next LOS, or two LOS, is G&H. We're asked to calculate and interpret demand and supply functions. And we're also asked to take the inverse of those to get curves. Remember, if quantity is the output, we're talking about demand function. If price is the output, we're talking about a demand curve. Now what we're going to do, we've got a supply function, presumably it's come from a regression, and we've got a demand function, again, from some form of regression analysis undertaken by the analyst. Now again, it's a very simple one here. We've just literally got price built into our model as our independent variables here. So we're saying quantity is a function of price and demand is a function of price. Hence, the supply and demand being described as functions here. Now, of course, we know the equilibrium point is where supply equals demand. So surely we can just set these two equations equal to one another and solve for price. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. So notice, therefore, that we're saying the quantity supplied, given by minus 600 plus 10px, has to equal the quantity demanded, given by 3000 minus 15px. Notice the coefficients as well that we've got here. Notice that the supply function has a positive coefficient with price and the demand function has a negative coefficient with price. We know this largely to be true. As prices rise, demand falls, but as prices rise, firms would be willing to supply more, so supply rises. Okay, so we've set the supply function equal to the demand function. QD equals QS. What we've now got to do is essentially solve for price. So let's do that. So we're going to solve for our price. Add 600 to both sides and you get 10px equals 3600 minus 15px. Let's add 15px to both sides, and we're left with 3,600 equals 25px. So therefore, px must be 3,600 divided by 25. So swing the 25 across to the other side by dividing both sides by 25, and we get px equals 144. Remember, you are expected to be able to do this, calculate in the exam. So the equilibrium price, where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, must equal 144. Now, again, we should be able to prove this. And this, if you suddenly lose the ability to rearrange equations in the exam, this is a get-out-of-jail-free tip here. Now, remember, it's a multiple-choice exam, so one of the answers they've given us is correct. Now, all we therefore need to do is plug the answers into the supply function and the demand function, and if the quantity supplied and quantity demanded are the same, we know we found the equilibrium price. Okay, now, notice if we plug in the 144 into our quantity supplied, we get minus 600 plus 10 times 144, we get 840. If we do the same for the quantity demanded, 3,000 minus 15 times 144, we get 840. In other words, quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Remember our shortcut? If you're unhappy about rearranging the equations, just plug in the answers. Remember, there's only 3 answers in the exam, to the supply and the demand function. And when the output of both comes out as the same, you know you've got your equilibrium price. In other words, use the fact that it's a multiple choice exam in your favour. Now, we're also asked to calculate the amount of excess demand and supply within our learning outcome. So here are our supply and demand functions, QS and QD, same as the previous slide. And notice we're going to look at a price of 120. Now, straight off, let's see if we can work this out intuitively. We know the equilibrium price was 144. But here we've got a price below equilibrium. Now we know if we've got a stable equilibrium, of course, the quantity demanded should be greater than the quantity supplied that would force price up. So my intuition says quantity demanded should be bigger than quantity supplied. And that might lead us to the answer without doing any calculation. But to do this LOS properly, all we need to do is plug in 120 to our supply function and our demand function. So minus 600 plus 10 times 120, we get quantity supplied 600 units. Quantity demanded 3,000 minus 15 times 120, 1,200. So notice, actually, this is fine. The quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied by 600 units. And this should force prices up, and we should move, therefore, back to our equilibrium point. Next scenario, the price is 160. Notice this time the price is above our equilibrium point. And of course what we've said all along is this should mean that supply exceeds demand, and that should force prices back to the equilibrium. So I'm going to bet that essentially at the price of 160, supply outstrips demand. Let's plug the numbers in. So minus 600 plus 10 times 160, quantity supplied 1,000. Let's plug it into our demand formula. 3,000 minus 15 times 160, quantity demanded 600. So notice supply exceeds demand by 400 units, and of course that should force prices down back towards the equilibrium level. Okay, now so far in our learning outcomes, we've seen the market mechanism as a way of establishing price or quantity. What we're now going to do is really turn our attention to other mechanisms for setting a price. And really, that's going to bring up auctions. Our LOS asks us here 2 things. Describe the types of auctions, and also to calculate the price that would win the auction. Okay, now let's start with common value auctions and private value auctions. Notice with a common value auction, the value of the item is the same for all bidders. Now notice they've given us an example of this, mining rights. The value of the item, let's imagine it's a gold right to mine gold, should be the same for all bidders. It's the quantity of gold within the mine times the price of gold in the marketplace. Now, of course, we don't know what that value is at the time of auction. We don't know how much gold is in the mine, and we don't know what the price of gold will be in the future when we extract it. So, key point is the bidders do not know value. So what is the danger here? Now, of course, the danger is we could bid too much. The danger is the winner of the auction bids more than the actual value turns out to be worth. And that, of course, is known as our winner's curse. Pay too much. Let's look at a private value auction. Notice it's very similar. The difference, though, between the two is with a common value auction, the value of the item was the same for all bidders. Our gold mine. With a private value auction, the value is different from all bidders. In other words, each bidder puts a subjective valuation on the item. I think of this like, we said antique auction, that's a classic example. What is a painting worth to you? Well, it might be worth more to me than it is to you, or vice versa. It depends on our own preferences and tastes. Now notice the maximum bid is the value of the item for the bidder. In other words, each bidder has a different benefit, gains a different benefit from the product, and therefore would have a different maximum price that they're willing to pay. Right, we're talking now about ascending price auctions, known as English auctions. Let's talk about ascending price auctions and then sealed bid auctions. Now, in an ascending price auction, the price starts low and each subsequent bid must be higher than the previous bid. So it must be higher than the previous bid. That's a key point. Must be higher than the previous bids. Bids are disclosed, publicly disclosed. This is happening in an auction room. Everyone's sitting together. People are putting their hands in the air to bid. So prices are rising. You know what the previous price was. And of course, the process continues until no one is willing to bid a higher price. So, remember what the LOS asks us to do. Describe how the auction works, but also determine price. So, let's look at the important little LOS here. Determine price. Simply, it is the highest bid. The last bid that is made will be the highest bid. When nobody is willing to bid at a higher price, then the person that put in the highest bid wins. Now, they've given examples here of automobile auctions, but also think about the large art auctions that you see on TV, the crowded, houses at places like Sotheby's, where a picture comes up for auction and the price just ramps up and up and up and up and up until eventually no one is willing to bid higher. And that, of course, is our English auction. Now, let's compare that to a sealed bid auction. Notice this time each bidder is only able to provide one bid. In an English auction, you can bid as many times as you want. If you're outbid, then you can submit a new higher bid. Not with a sealed bid auction. What everybody's doing is really placing their bids in envelopes, submitting them, then somebody is going to open those envelopes, and the person that bid the highest price, they're going to be the winner. Now notice, a significant difference that we have here is you do not know what other bidders have submitted. Now compare that to the English auction. We're all sitting in the same room listening to the bid prices. You know exactly what the last person bid. If you want to win the bid, you're going to have to increase your bid. Here with the sealed bid auction, we don't know that. We don't know what everybody else is bidding. Now, of course, notice the highest price wins and they pay the price that they bid. Okay, now that's the same as the English auction. The highest price will win. Now, notice here, though, we're talking about the optimal bid is actually different from the reservation price. Now, the reservation price would be the maximum that you would be willing to pay. But the optimal bid in a sealed auction is actually only 1 cent or 1 pence, one unit of currency higher than the next highest bid. The problem is you don't know what the next highest bid is. Whereas in the English auction, of course, you do. So therefore, the optimal bid is actually lower than the reservation price for the consumer or the bidder. And government contracts are often allocated this way. Now, our next type of auction is our second priced sealed bid auction, known as a VIC-RAY auction. Again, look, sealed bid, each bidder provides one bid. All bids remain unknown to the other bidders. So this is exactly the same as our sealed bid auction that we were just describing. Here is the major difference. So this is what you need to focus on for your VIC-RAY auctions. The highest bid wins and pays the price of the second highest bidder. Now, notice with our previous sealed bid auction, the highest bid wins and paid the price that they had bid. Here, the highest bid wins, but only pays the price that the second highest bidder had bid. What that means now is your optimal bid will be equal to your reservation price. In other words, in the previous scenario, there was always a danger that we would bid too much. In other words, our reservation price, what we're willing to pay, actually the optimal bid would be lower than that, because the optimal bid was only 1 unit of currency higher than the second highest bid. Now here what they're saying is, if you only pay what the second highest bid is, then your optimal bid will equal your reservation price, because there is no penalty from bidding your reservation price, because you're only ever going to pay what the second highest bidder paid. Whereas, of course, the danger is in the normal sealed bid, if you bid your reservation price, that could be way higher than what the second highest person has bid, and then you feel that you've bid too much. And apparently, stamp collection is done by VIC-RAY auctions. You have no idea about that, but we'll accept that to be a fact. Oh, sorry, moved the slide on too fast. Let's go back. I missed our Dutch auction. Dutch auction, again, very common. So notice this time we start with a price greater than that the bidders are willing to pay. In other words, we start with a price where no quantity is bid for. And what the auctioneer is going to do this time is can drop the price by increments until bidders agree to pay. Now, what the bidder is going to do is state quantity. Now, the auctioneer is going to further reduce price until finally they've sold all their quantity. But notice, bidders pay the price they bid. So the last person to bid for some quantity is going to pay the lowest price. If you're the first person to bid, then you're going to pay the highest price. Now, of course, you might be paying the highest price, but, of course, you're guaranteeing that you've got access to quantity. If you hold on and you wait to try and get the lowest potential bid, then, of course, the danger is quantity could run out before you've made your bid. There's some danger there. But notice, in a descending price auction, you pay what you bid. Now, let's compare that to a modified Dutch auction. And modified Dutch auctions are common in government bond issuance. We see it as the mechanism that's used to issue US treasuries. We also see it in the UK as the mechanism that the Debt Management Office uses to issue UK government gilts, which is just the UK version of a US treasury. So this is very common in government bond markets. Now notice, first of all, very common to a Dutch auction, we start with a price that is greater than what bidders are willing to pay. Then the auctioneer is going to systematically reduce that price until they hit prices where bidders are willing to pay. Again, the bidder is just going to be stating quantity here. Now, the price is going to be further reduced until all is sold. Now, hang on a second. All these points that we've just discussed here, so in other words, our first 4 bullet points, that sounds just like a normal Dutch auction, and it is. But here is the difference. So this is where you need to focus on for your modified Dutch auction. With our normal Dutch auction, each bidder paid the price that they had actually bid. So in other words, each bidder is paying their own unique price. Here, we all pay a single price. Everybody pays the same price. And what is that price that we pay? It's the price that the last bid that's made that means all quantity is essentially sold. Okay, so in other words, we all pay the lowest price that cleared the quantity sold. And it's a single price to all. Non-competitive bids here, where bidders state quantity but not price. So in other words, you're not stating the price you're willing to buy at. And what you end up doing is paying the price derived from the modified Dutch auction. And again, they're saying this is the case of US Treasuries. It's also the case for UK government gilts. They have a competitive market, which is just the modified Dutch auction, and a non-competitive market, normally a much smaller quantity of a government bond issue in the non-competitive market, where you just pay the price. You bid quantity and you pay the price from the competitive auction.